Hello, everyone, and welcome to our May event from the Rhine Research Center. This is an event that is part of our 90th anniversary celebration, the 90th anniversary of the lab being founded at Duke University, the Rhine Research Center being the current incarnation of that lab that started back in 1935. So 2025, it's our 90th anniversary. For our 90th anniversary, we've been having a number of different speakers come in who have had a background with the Rhine. People who've spent time at the Rhine, learned a little bit about their crafts from the Rhine, and gone on to do many different things in the world. Tonight, we're lucky enough to have Christine Simmonds-Moore with us. I met Christine. It's been 15 years now, Christine. It was a long time ago that we first met at the Rhine. We met at a research team meeting whenever I first started coming to the Rhine. Christine has already been at the Rhine for about a year or so at that time. We found that we had similar interests and that we were very interested in understanding not only uh, the details of parapsychology, understanding how it worked, but also how other people learned about parapsychology and how we could help to spread the word of parapsychology. We have worked together on a number of a couple of different projects over the years. Most recent one, we were working on a project related to aphantasia and psi experiences. But we also have worked on projects related to the educational opportunities. I've helped with her courses. She's helped with our courses at the Rhine. She's just been a great friend of the Rhine for many years and just a great friend in general. Without going into any further detail, because I know she's going to talk about this a little bit more, let me just say thank you for being here with us tonight, Christine.
Thank you again for inviting me. Good evening, everybody. I am very excited to be here. I'm just trying to figure out how to get this bit out the way. There we go. Yes, as John said, I've been connected to the Rhine for a while now. It's a great honor to be here tonight. I have great affection for the Rhine Research Centre, both personally and professionally, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So in this presentation, I will discuss my own journey into parapsychology, followed by a discussion of the main focus of my research, which has mainly explored individual differences, individual difference correlates of psi experiences and psi performance in controlled experiments, and what we can learn about these correlates for better understanding these intriguing phenomena. I'm going to be particularly focusing on synesthesia, which I will define later, but I'm also going to be talking about some related phenomena, related experiences, and variables, and unpacking the features of these the nervous system that really sort of renders people more likely to have psi experiences. So really what synesthesia can tell us about psychic experiences is what we'll end up talking about today. But we're going to begin with a little bit about my journey, and it's going to be just a couple of slides because I could do the whole talk on this, and I want to talk about personality today. So I'm always asked, why am I interested in these things, these really cool experiences? Well, first of all, they're really cool. I've always been fascinated with mystery and exceptional experiences ever since I was a child. I was the kid who was digging for treasure in the garden, and I was always fascinated by ghost stories. And I know there was a group of us in the sixth form, which is between 16 and 18, at school in the UK. And we were always kind of talking about local ghost stories. And I just remember one particular story really fascinated me, because one of my friends lived in this really old mill, and the mill had a ghost that was reported there. And her mom, my friend's mom, had actually seen this ghost. And it was a maid, a ghost of a maid that was walking down a corridor and then seemingly disappearing through a wall. And that just grasped my attention. I was finding books on parapsychology at jumble sales and secondhand bookshops, and didn't really know that you could actually study this stuff until later on. So we'll jump forward a few years, where I end up doing an undergraduate degree in psychology at the University of Wales in Swansea, which is in South Wales. Beautiful part of the world, incidentally. And so I actually went there to do a degree in French, but switched over to psychology because I felt that I could do more with psychology. And I found myself studying the hypnagogic state of consciousness for my undergraduate research project. And for those of you who don't know what that is, you've all experienced it. It is the in-between state between wakefulness and sleep, that kind of drowsy place as you're drifting off to sleep. And there's a similar state at the other end of the spectrum when you're waking up. It's very dreamlike. And as I was studying the state, I happened to discover in my readings that it was a very common state for ghost experiences. And so I was always really interested in this, but again, didn't know I could actually study parapsychology. Although at the time I found lots of journals by a famous skeptic in the library at Swansea, and they stopped in the 1970s. So again, I thought, oh, I can't do this, but this is so interesting. Later on, I went to work at the University of Wales. And so I was, first of all, this was after doing a master's in cognitive science, because I did that because I wanted to know more about cognition before I sort of did a PhD. So I moved to North Wales. As you can tell, I like Wales. And you can see the pictures and maybe get a sense for why I like Wales. It's also rich in folklore and very beautiful, lots of experiences in the mountains too. So whilst I was at the University of Wales, I sort of had a change of direction. I was going to be doing a PhD there, but I had a change of direction, and I happened to discover an evening class by a person called Robert Turner. And Robert Turner was a really interesting guy who happened to be friends with Bob Morris at the University of Edinburgh, and he did an evening class on parapsychology. So I jumped on this, and as a result of the evening class, the guy had convinced me to contact Bob Morris and told me I needed to do a PhD in parapsychology, and I said, yes, I do. And then jump forward another few years, well, not that far in the future, I found a PhD studentship at the University of Northampton with Dr. Chris Rowe. He's now Professor Chris Rowe. And Chris Rowe had done his PhD at Edinburgh under Bob Morris. So it was part of this kind of intricate UK parapsychology family. And I didn't really want to go to Northampton. I wanted to go to Edinburgh, but it was perfect. It was a perfect landing spot. And so that's where I did my PhD on schizotypy as an anomaly-prone personality. And we'll come back to that a little bit later as well, because really these are the seeds of what I'm still doing. So I've always been studying the same things. I'm just looking at them in slightly different ways and interconnecting them and digging deeper and following the thread as I kind of discover more and more about how all of this works. So this is a very short version of my journey, but as part of my PhD training, because a PhD in the UK is doing a PhD by research, I managed to convince the university that I was going to do the summer study program in parapsychology at the Rhine Research Centre for my specialised training for my PhD. And this was a 2-month program at the time, and it was at the building on East Campus. And so I think this is the right one. It might not be on the slide. And I've also got the new building because I've been in both. And there was also a building, I believe, at West Campus that was the original Duke Parapsychology Lab. I wasn't in that one ever. So I just loved this program. This was just immersive, fascinating. Every day we met a different parapsychologist or skeptic, and we got hands-on training in parapsychology and theories of psi, and it was just wonderful. And I also met my husband on this program. So again, the Rhine has been influential in both my personal and my professional life. So that program was amazing. I finished my PhD and got my first academic position teaching psychology and parapsychology at Liverpool Hope University in the UK. And it was great. My first job was parapsychology as well. I had to do other things as well, which is what we always have to do as a parapsychologist. But as part of my time there, I took a sabbatical from my teaching position at the Rhine. And originally it was going to be for just 1 year, but I ended up staying for 2 years. And I was working on 2 research projects that were funded by the BL Foundation And that is, for those of you who don't know, it's a foundation that funds research in parapsychology. They're based in Portugal, in Porto, and they are just wonderful supporters of research into these areas. And I've been fortunate to have several grants with them since that time. But at the time, I was a researcher, and I was working with Jim Carpenter on a Gansfeld project. In the bottom right, you'll see me. This is me from the first day of my PhD um, for the prospectus of the University of Northampton in a Gansfeld setup. So Gansfeld is a really fascinating experiment. I studied the Gansfeld for my PhD work, and then I was also working on a Gansfeld with Jim when I moved to the Rhine. I was also working on a project on healing, and that was with John Palmer and Steve Bauman, who is now deceased. And that was also a really fascinating project. And we were looking at whether healers could protect hemolysis of red blood cells when we put the red blood cells into a saline solution. So I just loved it. I loved every minute of it, meeting psychics and healers and connecting with the other researchers at the Rhine and making really lifelong friends, I would say. So I went back to England, and then I later returned to the Rhine Research Centre, and I worked for 2 more years as a researcher. The second year was where I had to make a decision whether to stay in the UK or move to the US, and decided to jump. And as John mentioned, that is when we began the Rhine Research Centre. Sorry, the Rhine Education Centre. We didn't begin the Rhine Research Centre, the Education Centre, but that was also the year that I left. I moved to Georgia with my family in 2011 to start working in the psychology department at the University of West Georgia there, because there had been always a kind of interest in consciousness and human potential. And the reason I applied was because Bill Roll had been there, and that is what drew my attention to the job ad. So I was fortunate to get that position the second year I applied and moved there, and I've been there ever since. And so this is our building. It's the oldest building on campus at the University of West Georgia. Not old in English terms, I will say, 1907, but still old, and definitely has a lot of personality, as you can see. And so I am fortunate to have access to this little tiny lab that's up on the second floor of the building. And we also have a group, a research group that we call the Exceptional Experience Research Lab. And so this neuroscience lab is kind of connected to us. And I've got a little psychomantium chamber set up in there. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And that's currently being turned into a Gansfeld because we are going to be running a Gansfeld at UWG that's part of the international replication attempt that is being coordinated by Etzel Cardinia and David Markusson Klaverts in Sweden. So yeah, lots of things are happening. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing, but it's really a group of people with shared interests in exceptional experiences, including psi, and I'll define all the things in a moment. And so, yeah, we're doing some interesting things. So that's just where I am now. So now we'll change gear a little bit, and I'll start talking to you about psi and what we can learn about psi and psi experiences by studying the correlates of psi. But we're going to start off with some general definitions. I think a lot of you know what we're talking about here, but I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So I will do some general definitions. So I really like this definition. It's the recent definition by David Vernon in his most excellent book, Dark Cognition. So he refers to psi experiences as a range of unusual behavioral and cognitive experiences that challenge current understanding and are at present difficult to explain, caveat being from mainstream perspectives. So these are some challenging experiences for the standard mainstream ways in which we might understand reality. And so the full range of human experiences includes all of these anomalies that we'll talk about in a moment. So people can report anomalous access to information, anomalous interactions with matter, and anomalous experiences concerning the relationship between the mind and the body. And these experiences are known more colloquially as extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, and experiences suggestive of the separation of consciousness from the physical body, including out-of-body experiences and ghost-type phenomena. And these experiences, as you probably know, are commonly reported throughout history. They're present cross-culturally, and in addition, these experiences can occur spontaneously and as a result of intentional practices, oftentimes associated with shifting one's state of consciousness. And that's our first clue. And we'll come back to some of those clues as we move through. And regardless of the reality, the ontological status of these experiences and phenomena, it's really important for us to understand the circumstances under which they occur for psychologists and parapsychologists. But particularly, I think, psychologists who oftentimes push these experiences to the side. But really, it's important. These are relevant to psychology, regardless of whether they're real or not real. We can look at the circumstances under which they occur. We can look at individual differences and other correlates, and that will help us more fully understand them. So with that said, it's important to look at the correlates anyway and understand the psychology. There is a lot of research that does find support for an actual anomalous process of information transfer, where there's careful control of extraneous factors, and any anomaly that happens is labeled as psi. And that's understood to be like X in a mathematical formula that will then be subject to replication and theorizing. So there is a whole range of ways in which we can look at these experiences. So we can look at them just in terms of their psychology, how people make meaning. We can look at personality and other correlates. And we can also do studies to see, okay, does this actually happen? And then, from my perspective, we can connect the dots and see, okay, what correlates with psi in terms of personality. And I think that synesthesia is very, very interesting as a clue into what might be going on and why. So again, these are not uncommon experiences. They're not something that people will have happening all the time. And even with psi performance in the lab, you're never going to see 100% accuracy. But you do see correlates. You see them being more likely in certain groups of people. You see them being more likely in certain states of consciousness. So, for example, precognition is really much more common in the dream state. And psi experiences generally seem to be more common amongst those who believe in these kinds of phenomena. But incidentally, you can also find these experiences happening amongst certain types of skeptic as well. And so that's some of the things that I've been studying, whether you have different types of skeptic. And it does seem to be the case that there are anomaly-prone skeptics that might have a certain kind of profile in terms of how they're wired, in terms of personality in their bodies, that might render them more likely to have experiences, even if they don't think that the experiences are real. So I think that's interesting in and of itself. So I think we can look at those groups who are more likely to have experiences, but also look at the groups who might not have experiences too. And I suppose that's the heart of the Ganzfeld replication study that we are involved in at the moment, to systematically explore where you might see psi happening and where you might see it not happening according to the way in which people are built in terms of their personality. So that's one of the things that we're looking at with that. I also have to note that it's important that we realize that subjective experiences that seem psychic do often have a normal explanation. We just mentioned that before when we looked at the idea that, you can look at these experiences from multiple perspectives. So oftentimes experiences that are reported out in the real world are very likely to be normally explained. But that's just as intriguing to me as psi explanations. Where we bring them into the lab, we can really see what's happening in terms of potential anomalous transfer of information and what correlates. And oftentimes those things, the correlates are common to those experiences that are reported out in the world and psi performance in the lab. So sometimes there are some commonalities there, and we'll look at that as we kind of move through, because I think, again, synesthesia and the other variables I'm going to be focusing on today, you can look at those and how they relate to psi experiences from a more normal perspective, but also from the perspective that sometimes they might be able to pick up on information that is non-local and be more psychic. So I think that we need to be looking at all explanations when we're looking at these correlates and looking at psi. So to understand more about the question, it's really important to look at qualitative research when we're thinking about what these experiences are like. So qualitative research is where we might do systematic exploration of people's stories. So I just want to shout out to Louisa Rhine's early research here, because this is part of the 90th anniversary celebration. Louisa Rhine was one of the first parapsychologists to look at qualitative research. And one of the things that she found was that there are different ways in which people experience ESP. Some are more aligned with imagery. So realistic imagery tends to happen in altered states of consciousness like dreams. Symbolic imagery too can happen in that state. And then some experiences are more about gut feelings and sort of compulsions, and others are more hallucinatory. So they're where the senses are kind of activated, but there's no actual experience right in front of you. But it does refer to something that seems to have happened at a distance or in alignment with somebody else. So there's different ways of experiencing ESP. And Louisa Rhine's perspective was that we can gain clues from looking at people's lived experiences. And so hers was like looking at this in, the early days of the Rhine. So while J.B. Rhine was doing his lab research, Louisa Rhine was looking at the letters that were coming in once the phenomena became known to the public, and realizing that this was a really rich resource for understanding psi. And again, with the caveat that sometimes subjective experiences are going to be different from actual psi, but we can gain some clues by looking at how people are experiencing these things. And so a lot of our research here at West Georgia, my research has also focused on qualitative as well as looking at personality correlates and sometimes fusing the things together. I should also mention that this dovetails with what John was saying earlier about our research with aphantasia. So the aphantasia study has been about correlates. So how much does imagery vividness relate to different ways of experiencing ESP and other psi phenomena, but also what is it like? So we did some really in-depth work looking at understanding how aphantasics experience consciousness, dreams, and where relevant, exceptional experiences, including psi phenomena. And so again, once you talk to people, you realize everybody's having these experiences in slightly different ways, but we can garner some clues in terms of what might be going on. But one thing that is suggested by a lot of the qualitative research and lab studies, I should say, is that psi seems to be manifesting as a kind of two-part process. So information is in the system, it seems to come into the system, and may or may not move to the second stage, which might kind of involve imagery or representations. And I'm going to say representations more. Now I'm really aware of aphantasia, which is where people do not have any visual mental imagery, but they still have knowledge and they still have psi experiences. So that study has really been quite informative, in terms of really thinking about how everyone might experience these things a little bit differently. But again, that sometimes people might have this kind of direct knowing and the information is there. A lot of psi experiences are incredibly meaningful. They often happen between people who know one another, or they might refer to events in the person's own life that are meaningful or significant. Experiences can happen under a variety of contexts, and we'll talk about correlates in a few moments, sort of state and trait correlates. But we can really learn a lot more about these experiences, I think, by looking at the correlates, but also, digging deeper and asking people, what is it like? I also want to say with this slide that, a lot of my research has focused on extrasensory perception, just like the rest of parapsychology. But there is also the question of psychokinesis. And Sally Feather and I did some research on psychokinesis when I was at the Rhine. And what I'll say there is that there are also apparently different ways of experiencing PK as well, but it's less explored than ESP. So a lot of my work today, a lot of my talk is going to focus on ESP. But again, psi experiences are complex and rich, and there's a lot more still to discover, I think. All right, so getting to the heart of the question. This is where I came from in my research, because I was always interested in what I have been calling anomaly proneness. I'm trying to think of a different way to define what I'm looking at, because I don't want to pathologize. A lot of my focus in parapsychology has really been on normalizing experiences. And so some people have noted that anomaly proneness sounds like a pathologization. So I'm just going to say individual difference correlates, or people who are more likely to report exceptional experiences, including psi. There are lots of individual difference correlates, and I've selected a few here. There are more than this, but there's not enough time to talk about all of them. But what I will say is that a lot of the correlates of psi experiences and psi share some common traits, some common ways in which the system is wired. And that's where we're going to end up today, looking at the nervous system of people who might be more likely to report psi experiences and potentially be more psychic. And so we're going to be particularly interested in synesthesia. But more recently, I've also been looking at ASMR. And I've got definitions and pictures on the next couple of slides, so you will know in a moment what I'm talking about. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at transliminality and related measures, and a little bit about creativity. Now, all of these things relate to one another. They relate to one another in terms of correlates as well, because transliminal people, it's a personality type, are much more likely to experience synesthesia than other people. But synesthesia is not necessarily, synesthesia is more rare, I would say. So more people are going to be transliminal than synesthetes. So I'll say it like that. Synesthetes and transliminals are much more likely to be creative, and all of these variables are very, very connected to creativity as well as psi experiences. So you can start getting a sense for what I'm talking about by looking at my pictures. I oftentimes think that pictures speak louder than words when we're looking at some of these things. So I'm going to jump forward to give you pictures of synesthesia. These pictures are more about transliminality, I would say, and we'll come back to that in a moment too, about connection. But synesthesia is better described with pictures because, one thing is they should be called the synesthesias. So it might need to be plural. So I just want to say that at the outset too, because synesthesia is something that happens when there is an extra way of experiencing. That's the first way to say it. So it happens when an inducing stimulus, which is called the inducer, results in the usual response, as well as an additional response, which is known as the concurrence. That's a bit of a mouthful. So it's like having an extra experience as well as your normal experience. So on the slide, I've got several examples. So the left-hand side, we've got grapheme color synesthesia. And some people will have colors in response to certain letters of the alphabet, sometimes certain numbers, or sometimes certain sounds. And every time they encounter that particular letter, they will experience the same extra way of knowing. And so let's focus for a moment on the number 5 here. Now, the number 5 is red on this slide. Now, some of you out there might be synesthetes and you might be disagreeing with this fact because everybody who experiences, a lot of people who experience synesthesia don't necessarily experience it in the same way, but it will be consistent for that particular person. So synesthesia is also run in families, and even if your mother has grapheme color synesthesia and has colors for numbers, it is very likely that they have very different colors for the numbers than you do. And just a note here as well, again, because John had mentioned our research on aphantasia, there is also the situation where you have aphantasic synesthetes. And so this blew my mind to begin with, but we can think about it logically when we understand more about synesthesia, because synesthesia happens in a variety of ways. So synesthesia happens as a sort of perceptual synesthesia. So you might have red for the number 5 and you see red out in space. You might have a knowing, like whenever you see the number 5, you kind of know it's red. And that way you don't need to have the image of redness. And that's where the aphantasia can come in. So they might just know that 5 is red. And then for other people, there's a sense of redness, maybe kind of flashing into the mind's eye. For other people yet, there might be sort of other ways of knowing, like a sort of color that's in the body, for example. So it's very complicated. But I think synesthesia has a lot to tell us about psi experiences and psi. It's very rare. It is happening congenitally or strongly in around 4 to 5% of the population. But synesthesias can also happen sort of contextually when people experience altered states of consciousness. And that's in people who don't experience it in their usual waking state. So I think that's quite interesting. It's almost like it appears, but only when one is in an altered state of consciousness. And a friend of mine in the UK shared the story with me that when she does yoga and it's the end of yoga, it's the Shavasana meditation and there's music in the room. And she shared with me that when the music comes on, when she's in this kind of very relaxed state, the music has colors. I'm like, oh, well, that's synesthesia. But it only happens in that state for her. So it's sort of a sort of contextual one that's emerging in altered states. So we've also seen synesthesias happening in other states that are also kind of associated with psi experiences, which is kind of where you can start seeing this linking in. So synesthesias can sometimes happen in meditation, in hypnosis, in hypnagogia that I mentioned before, the in-between state between wakefulness and falling asleep. But also you can see some synesthesias emerging in psychedelic-induced states. So these different states of consciousness can encourage synesthesias that are not experienced in the waking state at all. Some people have reported synesthesia happening following neural damage, and that's acquired synesthesia. And there's also some evidence that some synesthesias can be learned. I think this is going to be more likely in people who are more likely to have psi experiences and have a certain nervous system that relates to transliminality. So we can start seeing that the variables I'm going to be talking about today are very, very connected. We'll come to that in a little bit. Let's see. Yes, there's different ways. We mentioned the different ways of knowing. You can have different places that you experience the concurrent. And yeah, there are different types of synesthesia. You've got several types on the slide, but there are way more than that. Some people say there might be even 150 different types because we can have different fusions of senses, fusions between senses and concepts, and between concepts and concepts. So it becomes much more kind of higher order for some people. And so there's a few on the slide that are more higher order. So, you know, some people have time organized in a spatial way. Sometimes it's colored as well. So on the time space example, excuse me. And then the bottom of the slide, we've got ordinal linguistic synesthesia, where people have got genders for numbers and sometimes maybe personalities for objects and things like that. But I think synesthesia has a lot to tell us about psi experiences, and we'll look at the evidence for that in a little bit. Synesthesia, as I mentioned, is very rare, and so I've been looking for a more common experience that might be somewhere to look for synesthesia-like experiences, but that is more available to researchers like myself. And one of the things that has intrigued me in my recent research in the last literally couple of years is ASMR. So it stands for Autonomous sensory meridian response. I should have put the whole thing up on the slide, but it's essentially the head tingles. So one definition is on the slide here, a phenomenon characterized by a tingling sensation in the scalp that spreads through the body in response to specific audio or visual stimuli, usually everyday objects or actions. So it's oftentimes very social, it's happening interactively, and somebody is experiencing a response in the body. So I think it's synesthesia-like, and there is some evidence for that in the literature as well, that it does correlate strongly with synesthesia, but it is more common. So where synesthesia happens in about 5%, we're seeing ASMR strongly happening in about 20%. So again, it's on a continuum, like other sensory experiences. So, sometimes you might just have a little bit of ASMR, or you might respond to one of those strange videos, and some people might be like strongly responding to lots of different stimuli. But yeah, we've been interested in that as another variable. The other thing that I wanted to introduce to you is transliminality. And again, I think that transliminality relates to the others. We need to do more research on how transliminality relates to ASMR, but it certainly relates to synesthetic type tendencies. And again, pictures speak louder than words. So if you look at the bottom of the slide on the right, I think that gives you a sense for what we're talking about. It's about fluidness and sensitivity and liminality and making connections. And you can see how it's strongly connected to creativity. Everything is more connected to everything else in a transliminal system. So it's about sensitivity, and we'll come back to that as one of the clues for why this might relate to actual psi and perhaps more normal explanations for some experiences too. It's about sensitivity to information from your unconscious and also from the environment. It's also about having a very kind of plastic system, an interconnected system, and about information moving across thresholds into or out of consciousness. So you might start thinking about how this might relate to psi experiences. So these are all interesting variables that I think have a lot to tell us. So I'll just go back and show you again: synesthesia, ASMR, and transliminality. Again, with the caveat that there are others that also definitely relate, but these ones I think are up there in terms of what we should be looking at. But people don't just have experiences in the waking state. Sometimes they have experiences in altered states. So we've already mentioned hypnagogia. There's sensory deprivation, lucid dreaming, sleep paralysis, meditation, stress and trauma, bereavement. So some of these are kind of more about active states and some of them are more relaxed. But all of these correlate with psi experiences. Psychedelics, all of these are interesting correlates of experiences. And sometimes, there is some evidence that some of these relate to psi performance and lab experiments as well, particularly meditation is one, lucid dreaming, sensory deprivation in the Ganzfeld. And then there's some evidence for some psychedelics potentially relating. That's the work of David Luke. But what I wanted to say is that it's really important to think about how everything works together. So a lot of my work is focused on personality, and I think personality is extremely important, but we have to think about context, and we have to think about how states and traits interact in terms of exceptional experiences, because sometimes they might add together to lead to really interesting things in terms of size. If you've got a system that is wired a certain way, it might be more likely to become psi-conducive with the right state of consciousness. So it's about a recipe. And also some people who aren't particularly prone to psi experiences in their waking state might sometimes develop psi experiences in the context of altered states of consciousness, for example. We do see people having a lot of awakening experiences, for example, and some psi experiences in the context of bereavement and stress and trauma. And so it might happen, out of the blue, and you might have perhaps one-off psi experience, and then perhaps that might lead to kind of more after that, or it might be just that you have this one-off contextual experience. we've got to think about how things work together. So these are individual things to consider, like they both correlate, but sometimes things might happen together, and we've got to think about how that might work together. And a lot of my recent thinking has been about the idea of psi and psi experiences as part of a system. So what do we know about psi? Well, we know that psi itself might be considered to be more liminal, and a lot of the states of consciousness that we have been talking about and the personality types that we've introduced are about people who are more interconnected with themselves and perhaps more liminal. Psi seems to emerge between individuals, so it's very relational, and I think it's about a system of different components. It seems to be better measured implicitly, so in terms of your actions and sort of where you're not trying to be psychic, but your body is being psychic. But it's also measured better in terms of physiology, and this certainly aligns with what Louisa Rhine was noting about the two-stage process of psi, that perhaps psi registers first at a lower level in the system, and then a second stage is going to perhaps bring it into awareness where we might then be able to grasp it. Or for some people, it's just going to be in the body and you're not going to be as consciously aware of it. So there are some studies where they've done both. They've tried to measure psi correlates in the body and consciously, and people might do really poorly with their conscious guessing, but the body is very, very good at psi. Psi is better encouraged in altered states of consciousness, so it's not just that we see psi being reported in these different states. It also seems to be happening at the edges of awareness and attention. And that also relates to how people experience psi, because psi tends to occur like a kind of flash of information. And I don't think I mentioned that earlier. I missed that from the previous earlier slide, that Gertrude Schmeidler had noted that psi seems to kind of burst into your awareness sometimes like a flash of information, as if it's kind of coming from a different source outside, the corner of your eye kind of thing. And there are theories of psi that would align with that, including our own Jim Carpenter's first sight model, that psi is actually kind of happening, first, before anything else, and then it's kind of orienting us towards or away from information in the world. And we're going to be more likely to see psi in the body, in our movements, in our moods, in our behaviors, but also in dream states. But from our perspective as well, we know that some people do better at psi tasks than others. And so all of this stuff is really important when we're trying to really make more sense of psi. So again, we look at personality, but we have to look at personality in context as a system. So this is not a new idea, the idea of psi as a system. I've been arguing that psi might be well thought of as a kind of fractal system. So a lot of work is suggesting that psi might be about correlations rather than a signal, and that lots of different components are important. So I suppose a real world example might be, it's about me being close to my sister in the UK. We're part of a system, and there's not information that's being directly sent. It's just between us. So that's the sender and the receiver are both important. But also we've got to think about features of target systems. So we need to think about the psychology of the sender, the receiver, the target information, the environment, in psi studies, the experimenter. So again, it's not a new idea, but I think it's just an important thing to remember when we're doing these studies. So several people have talked about that in the history of parapsychology, so including Adrian Parker with the Gansfeld, von Lukadal's MPI, Stanford's conformance model, Roll's psi system, Storm and Thalben's psychopraxia. All of those are talking about different components that are sort of working together. So all of that to say that, perhaps we should expand our focus. And I actually have been doing something like this since I started my PhD, like trying to look at the personality of the sender and the receiver. But a lot of the focus in parapsychology has tended towards focusing on just the receiver, the person that is in an ESP test that's trying to guess what a target is, when we do need to be thinking about everything a little bit. And I think we need to be, using the metaphor of fractals could be very useful here. Resonant information and people connecting and targets being, targets that are more likely for people to find meaning with. Okay, so an example is a study that we've been doing at West Georgia that I've finished now. I need to write it up for publication, but this is one way that we've been trying to look at this idea. So yes, I think there is a psychic personality, but in context and as part of a system. So we had 5 senders, I think. Yeah, 5 people that wore rings for about 5 weeks. And we were interested in their experiences and their personality. We had different objects, different rings, and we bought control rings as well as rings that were worn. And we were interested in looking at the different materials that the rings were made from. So we looked at quartz, copper, gold, silver, and steel. And it's very much a pilot study, really, but just to sort of explore this kind of idea. And then we were mainly focusing on the personality of the receiver, again, like the person who was coming in and trying to guess which of a set of rings had been lived before. And we had lots of fun talking about Lord of the Rings and ring bearers and things like that as part of this study. But the idea was to really sort of explore, does synesthesia and ASMR have an association with psi? And does that work better with certain types of target? And does that work better when you've got senders who have certain personality types? So that's the kind of idea that I think we need to be perhaps doing a little bit more. And I will tell you some of the answers as we move through. Don't worry, it's coming. So again, like I haven't really explained to you why I think that synesthesia might be helpful for us for understanding psi. But I think that synesthesias can be useful in this context because I think some psi experiences can be complex ways of looking at synesthesia or synesthesias that are unusual, but not unlikely, because there is some evidence now that synesthesia can occur in response to unconsciously perceived information. And if that's the case, and that we can respond, or people can respond, particularly in altered states perhaps, or if they're wired a certain way, then there might be a whole range of experiences that might be synesthetic, but also potentially sometimes psychic. So the inducing stimuli might be emotions, so you can't see those, but you might feel them and then experience a sort of color or a tangible experience for that. And that could happen as a more normal way of experiencing, perhaps somebody who's in front of you, and you might experience a sort of color around them when they get angry. It could look a lot like an aura, or it could be that you experience a color when you connect with them. And I've had one of my participants tell me about that. That might be more of a normal way of looking at how this might happen. It could also happen with personality. Perceived spirituality could work in the same way, perhaps as a kind of ASMR type of experience. Perceived beauty, health or ill health. And again, when I was at the Rhine, there was a demonstration one day of somebody who was able to do intuitive diagnosis that seemed very synesthetic-like to me. And the person was talking about different colors associated with health or illness as she kind of moved her hands over the body of somebody. So that could be, something normal or perhaps psi related. It could also be things like electricity that we can't see, but we might feel. Infrasound, so sound that's very kind of low. We can't kind of consciously detect it, but we might feel it in our bodies. Geomagnetism, but even ESP. So it might be that sometimes people might have a synesthetic response or something that is present but invisible. And then because they might have synesthesia as a trait or something that emerges, like we talked about earlier, as a kind of contextual synesthesia, they might have a sort of tangible label for something that they can then grasp, like a ghost, for example. Um, or, okay, I know that there is information here. So it's like you have a label for something with the concurrent. So again, like some things can be explained normally and some might be more due to anomalous processes. Hopefully that makes sense. But I
Hey,
think,
Christine,
yes.
can I dig into this a little bit more with you because I think
Oh,
it's a
yeah.
really interesting point,
Yeah.
and I want to try to see if I make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So you're saying that the inducing stimuli, it may
Hmm.
be that someone is having an emotional response, and then they're experiencing it maybe visually or in an
Hmm.
auditory way. So
Yes.
it's that they're having this emotional response, or maybe a perceiving beauty or health or illness in a person,
Yes.
but they're actually interpreting it or seeing it or having a visual experience or having an auditory experience that we wouldn't normally relate to an emotional experience.
Right. Yeah. So it might be that you see emotions in a different way, or you might have a color, or you might have, like, so say if we do link to the psi situation, and the reason I've got infrasound up there is because Steve Parsons did a study at Liverpool with a medium, and he was pumping infrasound at the Albert Dock in Liverpool. And what happened was the medium experienced kind of grey amorphous shapes when the infrasound was playing. And what was interesting as well was that the medium um, described that as a very similar experience to when he felt that spirits were there. So for him, it was similar, even though it was infrasound. So it could have a more normal explanation, or it might be that amorphous stimuli um, kind of are weird, and maybe it's sometimes spirits and sometimes a more normal explanation. But yeah, that kind of thing, that is a transference of information. So information's coming in, and so for most of us, we might not have a representation for invisible information like emotions, personality, psi. It might just be in our bodies. But for somebody who is a synesthete or somebody who has induced synesthesia, perhaps in an altered state, um, you might have a kind of tangible, graspable experience that you can then say, "Oh, I had this encounter, and it felt like this." Or it might be the ESP might come as certain images for some people, like certain kind of shapes, symbols for some people, because it could be that it might work more in more complex ways for people who are more practiced psychics.
So,
Does that make
so
sense?
yeah, and so if someone were like, for example, if someone who's a synesthete with
Hmm.
emotions, if they're having an emotional experience of either sadness or joy, they may have certain shapes associated with it,
Yes.
or some other type
Something.
of stimuli.
Yeah.
But let's just stay with states for a second, and they may not consciously be aware that they're experiencing joy or sadness, but when that shape appears, they recognize it
Yeah.
as joy or sadness. And so they're able to, so the unconsciousness, the fact that they're not even consciously aware of the emotion, but they're able to recognize it because of because of their synesthetic connection to it.
Yeah, but I think what I was meaning was emotions of other people. But yeah, it could be your own emotion. It could be anything that's about you, and you might notice this yourself if you are kind of um, falling asleep or in a meditative state, that sometimes maybe the music does start kind of whirring into shapes. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. But it might not always be something that we can see, because we can't see emotions. But under certain circumstances, maybe we can. Um, yeah, so I suppose like it might be. I mean, I think it makes sense if you think about people who do report auras. That's one way to look at it. That they do that, but then they will realize retrospectively that perhaps purple might mean, oh, I connected with you, I feel connected, and that's why I'm seeing purple. So it kind of allows them to sort of have a way to unpack what might be going on rather than like, oh, there might be awareness of the emotion in the body, but you have this label that you can then play with and unpack.
Well, thank you. I think it's we've got into this enough. I think, but it felt like it's something we needed to really explore a bit more because I think it's a really important point. So thank you for going into it with me.
Yeah, no, that's okay because I think that's like the heart of what I've been arguing that synesthesia can be can help us to see the invisible. I think that's how I've talked about it before, that it can help us. And so I think, it can explain some things normally, but some experiences might be more aligned with an anomalous process of information transfer. Um, so there is evidence for that actually. So um, jumping to the next slide, there is evidence that synesthesia does relate to psi. So if we're kind of talking about psi, it relates to a range of psi experiences. And several authors, including myself, have considered that synesthesia could be a kind of building block for anomalous experiences. And this is not just me, it goes back to Frederick Myers and Carlos Alvarado. Frederick Myers noted that synesthesia might contribute to unusual experiences by facilitating a connection between a person and his or her transcendental environment. So it's like about connecting, but also, I think, having a label for that connection. I think that's what I would add. And so, yes, synesthetic experiences correlate with a range of psi experiences. It also, yeah, seems to relate to psi. And so Ed May has noted that all the remote viewers that he's worked with tend to be synesthetes, which I think is fascinating. And his model of precognition has synesthesia as a core component in the psi process. So here he's talking about synesthesia being important in bringing the information into consciousness, which is kind of what we're talking about. If you can see the invisible with synesthesia, it sort of allows for things to be kind of bound together, I think, and have a sort of tangible label to them. So that's part of his theory. And let's see, there hasn't been enough research on this, mysteriously enough, but there's been a little bit. So there was one study that found support for an association between synesthesia and psi, but it's just, I think it only had a few participants in it, and that was from 97. And then my own work found no differences between synesthetes and a matched control group on BEM's precognitive memory task. But then there was a post hoc difference in terms of synesthetic associators, people who were experiencing their secondary experience in the mind's eye. They did better at Daryl BEM's precognitive memory task. And then we have some really interesting findings from our psychomantium that really align with what we were just talking about. And I appreciate the opportunity to dig a bit deeper. But yeah, we found that among the synesthetes only, there were anomalous interactions between the environment and subjective experiences. And so the environment, as in the geomagnetism, again, an unseen, invisible stimulus. So the fluctuations in GMF correlated with the experience of a presence, like whether the presence was kind of internal or external. And then there was also a correlation between I think it was, yeah, the extent to which something was felt to take up space and random number generator anomalies, but only among synesthetes. And it was like, a decent correlation. It was like minus 0.6 for synesthetes, but not significant overall and not significant for the not synesthetes. So there's something here about synesthesia and anomalous interactions with unseen stimuli, and here like anomalous entanglement correlations perhaps. So yeah, it needs to be kind of further unpacked, but there's definitely something intriguing about synesthesia. And similarly with ASMR, and I forgot to say there was also, yeah, we found synesthesia correlating with some of our psychometry targets as well. ASMR also seems to correlate with several variables that also correlate with exceptional experiences. So that's interesting. Very understudied in the literature, and we found that it does relate to a range of psi experiences, and then fairly hot off the press findings that ASMR does also relate to psi. And I'm going to say again, under some circumstances, because it's about the system. So it seemed to work for, particularly for quartz, which is actually interesting because we were expecting quartz might work better. And you know, in the right direction for silver. So again, it's very pilot, this study, but just to say there's something interesting about ASMR, and it's really cool because ASMR, like I've said before, might be a more common form of synesthesia that we might be able to really sort of recruit more people who experience this strongly than synesthetes because they're very, very rare. And then transliminality also correlates with a range of psi experiences and other exceptional experiences. We found it relates to ghost experiences, particularly those with a paranormal interpretation. Mixed studies on how it relates to ESP. Creativity that correlates strongly with transliminality is really strongly associated with psi tasks. And then again, in our psychometry study, we found that there's a really strong correlation between the personality of the sender, but we only had 5 senders, so you know, to be further explored. But point 9 is pretty cool. Transliminality and success, like the rating of the target ring in the psychometry study. So it's very, very interesting, I think. So I see we're at 59 minutes. How long do I have, John? Okay, I'll keep going unless I'm kind of coming to the end of my time. All right, so we have some clues then about how psi and psi experiences might work if we look at qualitative research. I mentioned before how valuable qualitative research can be to unpack more about how experiences are playing out. But here, you know, to really sort of further unpack what might be going on with synesthesia in terms of how it might relate, and then also the other related variables, because I think that they're all connected. But you can see here that there were some interesting themes that I pulled out from a strong synesthetic experiences. So this person had lots of different types of synesthesia, but was also a very creative person. And so it seemed like this showed that synesthesia had a role in enabling psi experiences, but also other exceptional abilities, including creativity. So he was able to improvise music alongside having a very exceptional memory and an aptitude for mathematics. So this was part of a previous BL study and suggests that several aspects of synesthetic experiences are really important. And so it seems like it's about the ability to represent aspects of the world, so including invisible phenomena, subtle phenomena, that can fall outside of language. So getting to the idea of seeing the invisible. So for him, it included emotional experiences alongside many others, so that he had just different ways of knowing. So he had sort of color-coded experiences that were highly organized into hierarchies of meanings. So for his experiences with music, he had notes, keys of notes, songs, genres of songs, and that he could directly and easily access the meanings. And I think that is just really at the heart of what we're talking about with psi. So first of all, we've got to try and make sure we understand, you know, so psi is coming into the system, and that might be for a lot of us. We don't always see it. We don't always have people able to kind of access the information. So I think if you can have a way to have an accessible, tangible way of knowing, you might be, and that you can actually download that meaning more easily, then you might be able to use the experiences more than other people and have availability, have that information available to you more than other people. So, oops, I think there's different nervous systems among those who are more likely to report psi experiences. So amongst most of us, we're just not able, everybody really, we're not able to detect and perceive all information. We just can't. Um, but some people might be able to pick up more than others. We've got individual differences in nervous systems. And so I think synesthesia is really at the heart here. And there are certain features of synesthesia that allow people to see the invisible. And so we've got sensitivity, we've got tendencies toward novel connections and plasticity, like making these kind of bringing things together, binding them together. We've got strong representations, and then we've got tendencies to have alterations in the state of consciousness. And finally, we've got metacognition, i.e., the ability to think about thinking and have control and flexibility. This kind of relates to what we said before about being able to sort of download meaning of the experiences that people might be reporting. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from synesthesia. And I do think it is interesting to think about another situation where you might see that people have different nervous systems and might perceive more. So one example outside of psi is tetrachromacy. So tetrachromacy is where people have four cones, and most of us have three cones. But if you have four cones in your eyes, you can see more colors. You just can. You've got a different physiology, you've got a different nervous system, so you're kind of optimized to see more colors. And so I think synesthetes might be optimized to have different sensory processing, including perceiving more than others, including potentially psi information. So sensitivity. There's a lot of research on sensitivity, and there's this idea of optimized sensory processing. And basically, we see this in synesthesia. It's a core feature of synesthesia. And we can look at this generally as a way for more information to enter the system in the first place from different sources. So, maybe we're not all picking up the same information in our bodies that we don't have access to. Maybe some people are picking up more as well. And there's been some recent research looking at psi experiences as more kind of subjective experiences, and sensitivity certainly relates to subjective experiences. But also you see sensitivity also kind of as a part and parcel of transliminality. And I want to say as well that we've also got some recent research by Liz Roxburgh, Malcolm Schofield, and David Vernon, and they have been looking at how sensitivity relates to psi and finding some interesting results. And so I think there is some support for the idea that sensitivity as a kind of component of synesthesia might be playing a role. So there's that as a first ingredient. Then we've got the tendencies to bring things together. So I'm calling this plasticity and tendencies to make connections, but think about it like a way to kind of roll everything together. So if you've got like information that's weak, so perhaps it's distant in space and time, or that someone else is thinking about, that's weak information. But anyway, with consciousness, you've got a lot of things that need to be bound together. So there is evidence for kind of this tendency to form connections in synesthesia and transliminality. And this tendency to make connections does also kind of relate to creativity and more kind of subjective psi experiences too. Seeing things that perhaps aren't there, but sometimes perhaps seeing things that are there because you're kind of binding things together a little bit. So I think that's all I'll say about that one. But I think, again, it's a really cool ingredient that we see as something that is in synesthesia and transliminality and creativity. I don't know to what extent this is the case for ASMR, but I would say I think that there is. I think there was some evidence that ASMR might be about kind of the brain being more connected than it might normally be in people who aren't expressing as much ASMR. There's also evidence for information that is usually outside or at the edges of attention or awareness in creativity, transcendentality, synesthesia, and psi experiences. So there's just more available. So you can think about it like an attentional window and focus. So maybe if you've got a kind of wider attentional focus, you're going to be able to pick up on a little bit more than other people. So it's kind of related in some ways to the idea of sensitivity, but it's slightly different because sensitivity was more about sort of, overall body-based sensitivity as well. This is about kind of cognitive sensitivity as well. So yeah, it's interesting. So synesthetes do tend to do better than other people on tests of embedded figures and change blindness, which are attention experiments. And yes, all psi experiences correlate with a range of states of psi tasks. Success at psi tasks correlate with a range of altered states of consciousness. And we've already talked about how psi tends to work better when we measure it in the body. So something about that psi is kind of there, but maybe we're more aware of it because our attention's wider. There's kind of more in the window than there might normally be. And again, it definitely relates to the idea of Carpenter's first sight model that we mentioned earlier again. Yeah, so also our research where we use an attention model to measure psi was very interesting. And so we found, I'm just going to read this bit out to you. Let's see, where's our section? I've lost it now. Yeah, so essentially we found evidence that kind of attention might filter psi in the same way that it might filter another ignored stimulus. So it's kind of a sneaking in. So attention is kind of involved in the psi process. And so there might be something there with our synesthetes. And we've also got this component, the being able to kind of wrap it all together and have a label that we can then make meaning about. And so imagery vividness plays a role here. And so this is one that I want to continue to think about, particularly with our recent research on aphantasia. But generally, we've got imagery vividness being strongly associated with synesthesia. You've got much more likelihood of having very strong and vivid imagery in synesthesia and psi experiences and psi. And there are generally stronger representations in synesthesia. So it's almost like you can grasp it more. So there's evidence that if there is information, you're just much more likely to have a stronger, perhaps more accessible representational picture for it. And, what I'm thinking is, we've talked about this a little bit today, but you've got this label or code that's kind of the result of wrapping things together that allows you to sort of see something that you might not normally see. So that might include psi information. So synesthetes have very good representations. We also have to think about different types of system. And so I've talked a lot today about synesthesia and having this kind of fluid, open system. But we have to also think about the differences between where people have a lot of information in the system and people who have a lot of information in the system and then can pick out the bits that are useful. There are very big differences between them. So for some, there might be too much information available to awareness. So they might be sensitive and there's lots coming in and it might be overwhelming. Whereas for others, it might be possible to dip in and out of the experiences that you're having. You've got a lot of information coming in if you are wired to be more, and I'm going to say anomaly prone here, or sensitive. Maybe sensitive is perhaps a better word. Sensitive to psi information and psi experiences. So some people are much more able to control when they're going to have an experience and then play with it and apply it. And so what we're seeing is that there might be, sort of personality differences between these different ways of being. So some people might be able to control access more than others. And that's not to say that people can't learn. And this is where a lot of my interest has focused, because I think it's about being more healthy to be able to kind of dip in and out and use the experiences rather than being overwhelmed with experiences if you are more sensitive. So we do know that from studies with people who've had a lot of psychic experiences, like mediums, for example, they develop strategies over time, and they develop the ability to sort of schedule when they're going to experience voices, and organize the experiences and make sense of them and use the experiences to help others. So all of those things can be, things that you might be able to learn to become more of a healthy, um, anomaly prone or sensitive individual. So we do have these different profiles of healthy versus less healthy, but I want to say it's not simply about fixedness, because there is the capacity for plasticity and to develop more control. But we do see that there are different profiles of people with psi experiences, and some people who are able to kind of be more organized and have more control tend to have more synesthesia, more creativity, and perhaps more psi as well. They actually are able to access the meaning and apply the information rather than being overwhelmed by the information. So that is the last main slide. So I just have a final slide about the fact I think that everything's a bit complex. So I think there are some features of psychic personality that we've talked about today. I think we can learn a lot from looking at these interesting individuals and their experiences from a variety of perspectives. But we can see that more information seems to register in the system because of this enhanced sensitivity. There's more of an ability to connect the dots between the information and bring it into an interconnected, vivid, and concrete form that's accessible. And there are perhaps more metacognitive abilities, so people can think about their thinking and be flexible and have more control. So there's more controlled movement into different states. And so that can help people kind of manipulate and look at images, to access meaning, and to sort of make connections with other people, and talk about their experiences and apply them within the social context. So yeah, I think the way forward is going to be to further explore these fascinating individuals, and again think more about the idea of psi as a system, um, as well as focusing on sensitive people, like how are they working with other sensitive people, or where does psi work best when we are thinking about the other people who are playing a part and the other components in the system, because it does seem to be that all of the things are playing a role as well. So I think we can learn a lot from psychic personality, but we have to think about the bigger picture as well. So thank you very much for your attention. Just have to kind of do a nod to the BL Foundation, who have funded a lot of the research that we've talked about today. So synesthesia research, aphantasia, and also I suppose I should also say John Bjorkheim for the psychometry experiment that I've talked about a little bit as well.
You really covered so much different information. It's always really amazes me how much you're able to pack in to the time that you have, and how much, because it seems that every time we speak and every time that we explore these topics, you've learned more
Yeah.
and you've explored more topics, and you are integrating it so well into the other things that we've already spoken about. And today was no different. So, so I really appreciate it. So, there were quite a number of questions that came up, and you spoke about, of course, synesthesia quite a bit. You talked about creativity, you talked about transliminality, and you talked about psi and how some of these things kind of connect together. I'm going to go back to something that's a bit more basic, and
Mhm.
A lot of people, when they think of personality, or they think about right brain versus left brain, creative versus logical. Now, of course, from our perspective, we don't see the right brain and left brain connections the same way, but there are people who are more creative and people who are more rational and logical and more process oriented in their approach to things. Is there something about psi that is related to either creative people, or logical people?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I mean, it seems to be that the right hemisphere might be playing more of a role, but again, it's not as simple as right versus left as you said. I think what it's about is about this kind of more fluid way of being, and that creative people are allowing more of the right hemispheric ways of thinking into their consciousness, because normally we're dominated by the left brain interpreter. And so, like the personality correlates that I've talked about today, they do tend to be more interconnected interhemispherically as well. And so you do have more awareness of more. So you've got more awareness of things that are kind of usually outside of awareness. So like right hemispheric, kind of more associational ways of being, but also, what's going on in terms of meaning making in the sort of subcortical ways of knowing, like, that are kind of more dominant in hypnagogia. So you suppose like creative people are using more of the brain and the body, and they're influenced more by that. Um, that's not to say they're not rational as well, because again, I think that kind of comes into the metacognition too, because I think what we see when we draw from creativity research is that people who are really good creatives that are able to kind of be healthy and use their creativity are just dipping into different ways of knowing. They can jump between rational, between more kind of fluid, intuitive, and back to rational. And that's what I mean as well with the psi, being able to kind of dip in and dip out of different ways of knowing. You're kind of like grabbing the fruit and then making the pie rather than, I don't know, just having fruit.
So,
Yeah.
would it be appropriate to say that people who are more creative, who are more fluid, might have more experiences because their edges are not as clear? They might have more experiences, might recognize things or experience more things than someone who might be more rigid and logical or rational. But someone who is more logical and rational may understand their experiences in a different way and be able to express them and go further with them.
Yeah. But I think that, people are a mixture of all things anyway.
Of course, of course.
And there's different types of creativity. I suppose we should say that. It's I think that creativity is complex, but it seems to be about dynamic shifts in different ways of thinking, not necessarily being in one all the time or the other. Um, but you do have the more sort of scientific convergent ways of thinking and solving problems in innovative ways.
Mhm.
But I think, you know, Nicola Holt is the person to talk to about creativity. But I read a lot when I was putting together the BL talk, and it does overlap a lot with psi. And it is what's happening in transdimensionality and psi, and I think synesthesia as well. It's just about, we need to learn from the different disciplines to kind of make a bigger picture.
Mhm.
But people, I think people are not just necessarily one way or another anyway, because even people who are rational have altered states sometimes, and they're irrational sometimes,
Yeah.
and then it's just kind of what you do with it.
Hmm. Yeah, and we are, yes, I'm very familiar with creativity as well, and I think a lot of people, as they consider creativity and what that phrase means, they
Mm.
think they have an idea of what it is because you kind of recognize it when you see it.
Yeah.
But to really define it, it's a lot of different pieces that come together in different ways.
Yeah, I've got a whole load of things I could have brought in to focus on that. I just mentioned it because it does correlate strongly with all the things, with synesthesia, well, synesthesia and transliminality and psi. It's there. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's like different forms of creativity, and then there's like personality that's related to creativity, and then there's like big creativity and little creativity. there's lots of ways to conceptualize it. But I think, yeah, for our purpose today, like we can think about like novel associations and having novel associations that are actually valuable for society rather than just being random, like something like AI might do. Because, AI could probably be quite novel, but whether it actually makes any sense is another matter. It might make sense, but it needs to be kind of applied and, useful within the kind of cultural context.
Mhm. So let's shift a little bit to transliminality.
Hmm.
And you described transliminality and discussed the relationships between transliminality and some of these other
Mm.
topics. But can you really help us to understand what transliminality, from your perspective, what it is, and how it might relate to psi?
Yeah, so it's about how how sensitive you are in a variety of ways. So somebody who is more transliminal is going to be much more likely to be influenced by information in the body, you're unconscious, more likely to, perhaps remember dreams and jump into different states more easily than other people, and be more sensitive to fluctuations in the environment. So, for example, geomagnetism, much more likely to kind of notice that and know when there's a thunderstorm coming, things like that. That's kind of like an everyday way of doing it, understanding it. And so I think with psi phenomena, I suppose a lot of transliminality, you can understand it normally and paranormally, because if you're sensitive, if you're kind of more porous on all these different ways, I mean, you are going to be more open to information coming in from various sources. And so if you're open to psi, which I am, I think that that can include psi information as well as all these other invisible sources of information.
Hmm.
And so it's there because it's a more normal, it's a personality dimension that we can all fill out and we all score somewhere. And some people will be like not at all transliminal, and some people will be very transliminal. The ones who are very transliminal are probably more likely to have psi experiences than others. And they may also be more likely to have synesthetic experiences. Um, and they may not have them all the time. It might be that they have them when they have, altered states. It's that you're more likely to have these kind of experiences because you're more likely to have altered states and more likely to pick up on information and more likely to connect things together and more likely to have a sort of, syncretic label. I didn't get into that as much because I know that time was going, but it's kind of synesthetic like. So a transliminal person will be more likely to have a stronger imagination
Hmm.
than somebody who's not transliminal.
And more likely to be aware of the
Yes,
experiences that they're having.
yes.
Because
Enjoy
a
them.
lot of things can happen in the subconscious that we're not consciously aware of.
Yeah,
And so making the connections might take a lot more effort for someone if it's subconscious.
definitely. And that's what I mean by like, I think I like to look at personality because we all have a certain score, but then I think the cream of the crop is going to be looking at the synesthetes. And so I'm kind of shifting a little bit, maybe, or looking at both and, because I think, we see kind of gradations within everybody. But I think if you want to look at a very interesting person who's probably more likely to actually be psychic, it's the synesthete, because they're probably going to be more transliminal as well.
Hmm.
And, like I say, like Ed May says that all of the remote viewers he's ever worked with, he thinks are synesthetes.
Hmm.
And that may not be word, but it's like it's interesting. I take it as very interesting. And it just makes sense to me logically that it would be that particular person who's going to be more likely to be actually psychic,
Yeah.
because a lot of experiences of high transliminals, you know, and some synesthetes too. It could be like there's normal explanations as well, but there's something unique going on in this 4%, 5% group, I think.
Mhm. Well, and it's interesting, that you're talking about correlations between synesthetes and
Yeah,
transliminality and psi experiences relating to each of these as well, and how
mm,
all of these and how creativity plays into it, which there's some underlying components that you continue to bring out
yeah,
that seem to be present in all of these different personality types.
Yes.
So it may not be that it's creativity. It may not be that it's transliminality, but there are components of each
Yeah.
of these that all seem to come together to enable more of the psi experiences potentially to happen or make it more likely
Yeah.
people would fall into multiple categories.
Well, that's why I'm trying to say here are the ingredients. There's a particular nervous system. We're not all wired like this. But some of us might have more of this than others. I don't know. But yeah, so the sensitivity and the tendencies to connect and the representations and the metacognition and the awareness of the unconscious, all of those things are I think, the ingredients. But I think they're all important, because I think there is a big difference between somebody who is healthy and less healthy.
Yeah.
And I think that the healthy people do better at psi, and that needs to be looked at more. But I really think that.
Mhm.
So and I don't want it to be like a death sentence either, because I think, oh, you're unhealthy. No, I think that there's plasticity and there's like potential to kind of to change that. I think there's a question from Christopher. I see a
Oh, there's
question.
quite a number
Uh,
of different
Yeah,
questions
so
oh,
coming in here.
thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's a topic I've been following now for about 8 years. So I really appreciate what you've said this evening. I had a question about Lance Storm and Adam Rock have talked a lot about imagery cultivation and kind of building on core shamanism, arguing that there's something about imagery that is psi conducive. And if you read a lot of more popular books by self-professed psychics, they will say, you've got to do your visualization exercise, you've got to sharpen the mind's eye. In your research, have you actually found a correlation between greater activity in the mind's eye and better success, or is it really not supported by evidence?
I love your question, and
It's a great question.
it's a wonderful question because it's something that we are thinking about at the moment with our aphantasia research. Yes, if you'd asked me before the aphantasia study, I would have said that imagery is really important. And I still think it is, but there's different ways of conceptualizing imagery. I think it's about having a tangible representation. I think that's kind of a nice neutral way of saying it. I think doing the aphantasia study has made me really aware of how people run meditations and run psychic development workshops and talk about imagination, because there's an assumption that everybody has imagery and they don't. And I, from our research, and going back to Louisa Rhine's research, psi is being experienced in a variety of ways.
Mhm.
And so I think, yeah, for a lot of people, I think imagery is a vehicle, but there's other ways of having imagery, and
Yes.
there are also direct ways of knowing. So I think we just have to kind of realize that there are different types of person, and psi might be experienced differently by different types of person. Because in our aphantasia research, John and I are finding that people are having direct knowing. It's almost like
Yes.
they can directly access the meaning. So I think, yeah, for a lot of people, imagery works, but then you can also have too much imagery. And
Mm.
if you start reading literature on imagery vividness, there's mixed literature on imagery and psi, because sometimes like people for certain types of study, you could have too much imagery and then the psi gets lost. Oh, it's really raining here. Wow. Sorry, just the storm just started. Yeah, you can have too much imagery and then it's, you might get lost in the imagery. So I think it depends on the psi task,
Mm.
and it depends on the person, and how you're trained, because I know when I first did the Gansfeld, I got too much imagery. There was
Mm.
no way I was going to be doing well. But then as you get practice with the state, I started noticing the difference between what might be my own imagery and then what might be more likely to be related to the target, and it just becomes different. So I think there's something about, it's just about mental control and familiarity with the state, as well as imagery cultivation, um, and just learning how to recognize information, I think is probably better. Would you agree, John? I know this is something we are thinking about now. We're going to be writing a lot about this as we move forward, but that's a great
Uh,
question.
yeah,
Well,
and
thank you.
so just to be clear, aphantasia is people who do not have any intentional mental imagery.
Hmm.
In other words, if you ask them to close their eyes and visualize an apple, they close their eyes, there's it's black, or
Hmm.
it's a very vague image. They don't have strong imagery. And it's something that we didn't even, well, I didn't even realize existed until a few years ago. And now almost every time that I speak about it, I have one person in the audience who stands up and says, "That's me." I
Yep.
didn't know people could actually visualize objects. I thought it was a metaphor.
Yes. It's
It's
so
happened
weird.
so often. And
Yeah.
before this, as Chris, like you said, Christine, before this, I would have thought visualization and strong imagery are essential,
Yeah.
almost a necessary component to psi.
Me too.
But it's important to recognize, even though visualization may be a strong assistance for some people,
Hmm.
people who don't have intentional visual experiences, mental visual experiences, still have psi experiences.
Yeah.
So it's not necessary to
No.
have this visualization.
No.
How that all fits together, that's we're trying to figure that out.
I think Louisa Rhine was onto it. And, and then if we start thinking about, ASMR, I mean, that's why maybe that's interesting because it's body based information. It's not a picture, but it's still like, oh, I'm getting something. Um, but just, yeah, that maybe it's tangible knowing, but there's different ways of having tangible knowing. Yeah.
Yes, and people who have aphantasia do dream.
Yes. Oh my goodness, they dream really vividly sometimes as well, we
Yeah.
found.
Hmm.
They just can't access it in the waking state.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think we just realize there's just so many different ways of experiencing the world. And I realized it before with synesthesia, but then in a whole other way, speaking to people who are aphantasic and then realizing you've got aphantasic synesthesia, it's just, yeah, it's really fascinating and life
And,
changing, honestly, because you start really rethinking everything
mhm.
about how you think and how you make meaning.
And
Um,
the language that we use when we discuss these things now,
yeah.
it's difficult not to speak of things in terms of images and seeing because these are traditions that we've developed over the years, but some people don't they don't experience the world that way. It's a different way of experiencing. Okay, so we have transliminality, synesthesia, creativity, and psi. It's but there do seem to be some underlying concepts of having a greater ability to experience, having larger experiences,
Hmm.
being able to understand it and name it.
Yes.
These tend to be things that are extremely important related to people who are able to not just people may experience psi, but
Mhm.
to experience it and then express it to other people so that we know that they're experiencing it. That's a whole nother step. And this is where the whole introversion versus extroversion discussion has come in many years ago. That extroverts are more likely to be able to explain or more likely to want to participate in experiments and explain it.
Hmm.
So we might find there's a higher correlation in that just because of the way we're structuring our studies.
Yeah.
And so, do you see a way of structuring experiments that might incorporate some of this new knowledge that you're gaining about how these things fit together?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, you're talking about something really interesting, like how do you get people to come into the lab? And we're facing this now, like with the Gansfeld study, we'll be recruiting people who are not prone to having experiences and are more skeptical and don't meditate. It's really hard to get those people in the lab because I think it would be really interesting to be more, to be systematic, because you do have more people who are more open coming in, but that's good. You can still do a lot with that. Um, I think you could do more with Psi as a system and looking at those kind of ideas. I don't know how you get people who don't think there's any possibility of psi coming in. That's always been a challenge for me. And I've worked really hard with this because I've done previous studies where I'm really interested in the psychology of skeptics. And I have managed in the past. I ran one study there when I was at the Rhine. And so it was interesting because sometimes there'd be a really strong skeptic walking past a really strong believer. I'm like, this would never happen anywhere else. But it was very difficult to do that. So it could be a bigger question. I mean, one thing to do might be to take experiments out to people a little bit more, which will be really good, and having more things out in the real world. I'm not entirely sure how to do that. Having psi studies on street corners.
With chocolate involved. I think someone
Yeah.
could offer them snacks,
Yeah. Well, because I know Richard Wiseman had a study at some point that was in shopping centres in the UK and trying to sort of bring it out there. But then he's known as a skeptic, so that kind of like creates another thing. Like people are more likely to be come and take part if they're a skeptic. I don't know. But something where you can sort of take it out a little bit more would be really good. We're building a wind phone here at West Georgia. I think I've talked to you about that before. Because of various reasons, we have to now have it inside. So we're trying to now work out a way for it to be accessible to the public and nature related. But the idea of that was that it would be something that people could find.
Right.
And so you make something more present in the community, people are more likely to participate, and it's more fun. I think play is really important with all of this. But yeah, I don't know how you find synesthetes and get them into studies. I think we have to think about things like ASMR and piece it together the other way, because I think that is still a type of synesthesia. And maybe it's finding high scoring transliminals that are healthy and that fit some of the other components. And that's another way to sort of unpack it a little bit, and sort of look at the healthy versus slightly less healthy transliminal. But some of that's already been done, but not enough yet, I don't think, with the well-being and how that relates to psi. Oh, here we go. More money. That would be good.
Right.
We need funding. That would be really good to be able to spend more time doing this, rather than squeezing it around teaching would be really good.
Now, there's a lot more we can learn about this. Christine, I really appreciate you sharing your time with us, and I value your time. We have one more question. Someone has their hand raised, and if we can get in a question quickly, Stanley, you want to?
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, from my personal experience, I found that when I'm working with a group of people, such as at psychic fairs, and my experience with silver mind control, and also in with holding sessions of psychokinetic metal bending, I find it a group enhancement effect. Is this something that you've investigated?
Oh, I would love to do more with that. I don't doubt it at all. I mean, only in sort of fun ways, because when I was at the Rhine, there used to be spoon bending parties, and then that's the whole kind of premise of the spoon bending, that there is something that happens that's more than the sum of the parts with the social situation and a shift in belief. And so it was a removal of disbelief, and then interesting things happen. But yeah, the social context really does need to be looked at a little bit more, and I haven't looked at that enough. I think there's something sort of magical that probably happens under those circumstances. I don't know how you'd study that systematically. It might have to be something that you do more as an observation and interviews, sort of as a starting point to, sort of tap into what people are experiencing and reporting. But I would suspect that there is something that happens, that is more than the sum of the parts there as well, especially if anomalies start happening.
I was thinking of holding groups of people and testing them in groups and see if you get an enhancement effect that way.
Yeah, that.
Jim Carpenter did some. There have been some remote viewing exercises where people work in groups and they use a collection of the information they gather from multiple viewers and only let the strongest information rise to the top, and they do get very good results using that technique. Jim Carpenter also published an article, it's been a number of years now, of some research that he had done working with groups and looking for common ESP experiences among a single group, and only letting that information, the strongest information that came from the group again, and
Mm.
using that information. And he got excellent results with that.
Hmm.
So there are some methods, and there have been some experiments done with that, but I'm not sure how that's been related to personality traits in any
Mm.
way. This would be a very interesting to have a person to try to compile a group based
Yeah.
on personality characteristics and determine, hey, this could be a way to kind of have dueling groups,
Yeah.
trying to see what psi games, right? Expanding our psi games concept,
Yeah.
and trying to see if there's any way that that might enhance performance that way.
I suppose we've done it when we did the dream precognition studies at Northampton with consensus judging, and we'd all be the receivers, and there was something there about us all kind of connecting, um, and all trying to pick up on the information. That was fun. But I that was weird though for me. Like I started doing better after the experiment. In the experiment, I was like totally null. But it was fun to do it in a group situation. I think that would probably be part of the ingredient that it's more fun to do it that way. And I think play is really important for Psy. Um, yeah, and there's lots of things still to do. I mean, that's the thing. Like when I teach parapsychology, I'm always like, well, yeah, we know this, but there's still this to do, and lots more to do.
Always, yeah, I always talk about it as a target-rich environment. There's always more things that we can pursue, we can explore. Thank you for the
One other
question.
thing, I don't know if was anybody has any theories as to how psi can fit in with reconcile that with the known laws of physics.
Oh, well, I'm going to say I'm not a physicist, but I like models like Ed Mays that he's trying to sort of he's got a physics domain and he's got a neuroscience domain. He doesn't really get into the psychology domain enough. But I think those kind of comprehensive interdisciplinary models are really interesting. There have been a lot of people theorizing about psi from all sorts of different perspectives. So I get annoyed when people say, oh, parapsychology has no theories. It does. There's not one unified theory, but then there's not one unified theory in psychology either. But yeah, there's the Handbook of Parapsychology has some good bits in there on different theories of psi.
And I have to say that theories of physics have been changing just over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And so it's becoming the whole foundation for physics that we grew up with is changing a great deal at this point. And so integrating in psychology with physics is becoming much more interesting as we
Yeah.
move forward, much less materialistic and reductionist
Hmm.
than it
Depending
was.
on the physicist you talk to, because
Well, of
physicists don't agree with
course.
each other,
Of
and
course.
physicists in parapsychology don't agree with each other. So it's very interesting, but definitely interesting read as well.
Right. So thank you, Christine. Thank you so much for the time you spent with us tonight. And thanks everyone for being here. We've had some interesting questions and talked about some very interesting topics. Christine, just tell us again how the Rhine has really this is the 90th anniversary, right? Can you
Yeah.
just bring it back to the Rhine and how the Rhine has led you to where it's led you? I mean, I know you met Steve, your husband, at
Hmm.
the summer study program. So obviously it's had a significant influence on your life.
Yeah.
Um, I'm just wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about that.
I mean, my life just would not be the same without it, is the kind of take home. It's just had a pivotal role I mean, like I said at the beginning, in my personal and professional life. I have great affection for Sally. Um, yeah, and I haven't seen her for a long time, but she has a big place in my heart. Um, yeah, and I feel like North Carolina, um, is one of my homes. I really do. And the first time I came to the Rhine, I really didn't want to come to America at all. I had a bias about what America would be like, and I just remember being so blown away by how beautiful and green it was in North Carolina, but also how hot. I was not expecting that. But just the whole experience, I mean, the summer study program was just phenomenal, and I wish we could bring it back in some way like that, or any version, because it was just, so interesting to meet all these different people and, skeptics and proponents and some people in the middle, and just, and then it felt like I know it just didn't feel very, very real when I finally had worked out coming over to work at the Rhine. I was just, this is my dream come true. It was amazing. And sometimes difficult because like the Rhine is flourishing now. And at the time, I think oftentimes I was in the building on my own when I was there. But it was just, I've met so many, again, lifelong friends through that. And, parapsychology is just a passion of mine and continues to be a passion of mine. And I just, I keep following the thread, but the thread led me to the Rhine and constantly leads me back to the Rhine. And, I'm glad to kind of be fortunate to have this position now at West Georgia, but I miss working there. I do. I miss working at the Rhine, but it's great to be teaching students, and hopefully I can, the students want to come and visit the Rhine. They're very excited about that possibility. So, if there's ways to sort of connect the dots in other ways as we move forward, I'd love that. But yeah, the Rhine has a big place for me, professionally and personally.
Well, and when I met you and we started one of the first things we talked about after we got to know each other a bit is the fact that there was no place to study
Mhm.
parapsychology in the States.
Yeah.
And along with Sangha, who
Mhm.
was the third person who helped us to form the Rhine Education Center, we were able to start to provide some opportunities. And you've gone so far past that now, being in the accredited and academic organization as you are. But we continue to grow, and it's really helped us to provide opportunities in places where other people have not had. We didn't have those opportunities. Well, I didn't have those opportunities locally. You
Mhm.
did find some opportunities in UK, but we
But
still.
yeah, but that was just through chance or not chance, maybe synchronicity. But I mean, yeah, I just, it felt like the right thing. I suppose like as I got into parapsychology, it felt like it was a big fight to get into it. And then it's been an interesting flow where I've kind of gone from one thing to the other and it's just everything's led to everything else. And so, um, yeah, I mean, the Rhine is synonymous with parapsychology. And so I'm really grateful to have a part in its history. And yeah, like I say, I miss it, but I feel like I'm still connected to it. So
Well,
yeah,
obviously you're still connected to it, and would love to have you come back anytime you're interested again. So thank you again for all the time you spent with us tonight, and thanks everyone for being here.